As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So despite the massive bombing campaign and ground invasion in Gaza, a senior Pentagon official believes Israel has not come close to taking out Hamas's leadership, and this was reported by the New York Times on Saturday. So the report reads, quote, one senior U.S. defense official who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive details said the operations so far have not come close to destroying Hamas's senior and middle leadership ranks, end quote. So according to Gaza's health ministry, at least 9,770 Palestinians have been killed in the Israeli onslaught, including 4,008 children. So think about that death toll. And I know Biden has tried to say that they're lying about this, but then you had the UN and aid groups that operate on the ground saying that it's reliable, and they actually believe the number to be higher because it doesn't count everybody under the rubble and people that were buried before, instead of sending their bodies to the hospital. So anyway, this New York Times report said that the U.S. was making suggestions to Israel to reduce civilian casualties, such as using smaller bombs. Apparently, that's one suggestion the U.S. gave to Israel. But when it comes down to it, the Biden administration is refusing to leverage military aid or refusing to use any kind of leverage over Israel. According to the Washington Post, the U.S. is not conditioning military aid or using other leverage it has over Israel because, and this is a quote from the article, I wanted to read this excerpt. It says, quote, it would be so politically unpopular in any administration, and partly because aides say Biden himself has a personal attachment to Israel, end quote. And this is Israel's heritage minister, Amichai Eliyahu. I probably butchered his name. But he said that dropping a nuclear bomb on the Gaza Strip was an option for Israel and claimed that there are no innocent civilians in the enclave. So according to the Times of Israel, Eliyahu said in a radio interview that dropping a nuke is one of the possibilities and said that there are no such things as uninvolved civilians in Gaza. He also called for the expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. He said, quote, they can go to Ireland or deserts. The monsters in Gaza should find a solution by themselves, end quote. So he added that the Gaza Strip does not have the right to exist and that anyone waving a Hamas or Palestinian flag shouldn't continue living on the face of the earth. So in response to these comments, Netanyahu suspended Eliyahu from cabinet meetings. He resisted calls from opposition leader Yair Lapid to fire him. And Netanyahu said, quote, Minister Eliyahu's statements are not based in reality, end quote. And despite, again, the massive casualty rate in Gaza, Netanyahu is claiming that Israel is operating in accordance with international law to avoid harming innocents, but that's pretty tough to believe when you see what's actually happening. And besides how provocative this statement is, and really genocidal if he's calling to nuke the Gaza Strip, his comments also appear to confirm that Israel has nuclear weapons. So that's another thing that Netanyahu might not be happy about, because Israel does have a nuclear arsenal, but it has a policy of ambiguity and does not officially recognize that nuclear arsenal exists. But they're always going on about Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons. All right. So the next one here, largest Palestine protest in U.S. history shut down the streets of D.C. So this article is from Mondo Weiss. And it's estimated that 300,000 demonstrators shut down the streets of D.C. in the largest Palestine protest in United States history, calling for a ceasefire and an end to the genocide in Gaza. So this was on Saturday, and protesters gathered in Freedom Plaza, where organizers delivered speeches and led chants in support of Gaza before marching to the White House. So if you saw this over the weekend, there's lots of pictures here, and 300,000 sounds like a huge number, but it definitely looked like a lot. There was a lot of people. They surrounded the White House, and it goes to show that there's a lot of opposition to what Biden is doing, what Biden is supporting in Gaza. And so the U.S. finally broaches the idea of peace talks with Ukraine. So NBC News reported on Friday that U.S. and European officials have brought up the possibility of peace talks with Russia in conversations with the Ukrainian government. And this is a big shift. Because the U.S. and its allies had discouraged the idea of peace talks since Russia invaded in February 2022. This whole time, they've said no ceasefire, no negotiations. It's up to Ukraine, and we know Zelensky's not going to do it. So this is a big deal here. And this report said that the conversations have included a very broad outline of what Ukraine might need to give up to reach a deal. Some of the talks took place last month at a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, and this is a grouping that has held meetings since Russia invaded Ukraine. It includes military representatives from about 50 countries. The talks about negotiations with Russia started due to Western concerns about the situation on the battlefield and the fact that it's becoming more difficult to keep funding the war. Former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, he recently said that he was playing a mediating role during some of these 2022 peace talks and that he believed no deal was reached because of the U.S. So he said he was mediating because Ukraine asked him to. He said, quote, "My impression, nothing could happen because everything else was decided in Washington. The Ukrainians did not agree to peace because they were not allowed to. They first had to ask the Americans about everything they discussed," end quote. So at the time, Russia's main demand for a peace deal was Ukrainian neutrality. There were some vague things about demilitarization, denazification that I think were up for interpretation, but the main thing was they wanted Ukraine to be neutral, and they weren't asking for territory. Of course, they would want them to recognize Crimea as Russian, but now, they've annexed all the territory that they control, and they have said quite a few times, the Kremlin has said that any future peace deal must recognize these territories as Russian. So Ukraine not only lost so many people since then, they're going to lose territory. Realistically, in any deal, they're not in any good position to negotiate.
Violence is wrong. Either you believe that or you don't. And if you believe all violence is wrong, then there's nothing to discuss except how do we bring about diplomacy and peace in all of the world's conflicts. Surely that at least should be sayable. But we're seeing politicians kicked out of their parties. We're seeing the word ceasefire being sort of essentially banned. Why is that? As I've continually said during this conflict, I am not in a position to condemn those who are inflamed, engulfed and lost in emotion as a result of the original horrific attacks in Israel or the ongoing military action right now and its obvious devastating consequences. I believe that if you are directly affected by that or you have an affinity with that, who can possibly deny your right to your feelings? What is interesting for all of us, and I would like you, regardless of your faith or creed or religion, to consider these perspectives, is people are making a lot of money out of this war. People are accruing a lot of power out of this war. People are being granted the ability to censor and cancel and possibly surveil and shut down as a result of this war. There are apparently plans to displace the entire Gazan population. That's something that's publicly understood now. Of course, the deployment of US troops is being discussed. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are making significant profits. So we're living in a complicated time, there's no question. Things change in politics all the time, we all know that. But there's Joe Biden saying that one of his concerns about Trump is that Trump had the potential to bring about a war with Iran. So has a great deal changed? Have Iran changed a lot of their policies and positions in the interim? Or has something else changed? Let's have a look. In an interview with 60 Minutes earlier this month, President Joe Biden boasted of the United States' ability to fight multiple wars at the same time. Good for everyone, good for business. We're the United States of America, for God's sake.
We're the United States of America, for God's sake.
I've seen him say that. I think this is not a cogent argument for bringing about limitless death. The most powerful nation in the history of the world, he assured his interviewer. Again, jingoism and deracinated wild patriotism are unlikely to bring about solutions in such a complex set of conflicts. We can take care of both these wars, the war in the Middle East and Ukraine, and still maintain our overall international defense. We have the capacity to do this and we have an obligation to do it. We are the essential nation, to paraphrase the former Secretary of State, and if we don't, then who does? Do you ever wonder what America's political role in the world actually is? What is it that America are doing? You'll be familiar with both the maps of China surrounded by American military bases and now the map of Iran surrounded by American military bases. The assumption is that America is sort of somehow policing the world. And the story, I suppose, is that's to protect you from the rest of the world. The most optimistic argument, I suppose, we could make is that if America didn't occupy this position as a kind of global police force, then terrorists or the Chinese or Russians would take over your nation. But surely it would be possible to have a literal defense rather than attack industry or a defense policy that was about, if anyone does anything like they're coming near us or our interests, then we will prevent that from happening using military might. I suppose that immediately poses a bunch of questions. Are there American interests that are overseas? It seems like there are. Are these interests involving resources? It seems they might. Are there alliances with nations that ultimately amount to resource-based alliances or alliances of dominion? And does the American foreign policy really come down to an appetite for unipolar domination and global hegemony? Do you ever get enough time in your life to say, would it be possible to just have a different type of life where America wasn't agitating for and aggravating wars because it's somehow beneficial to the military-industrial complex? Mightn't it be better for us as ordinary Americans, just our neighbours and our homes and our day-to-day lives. I mean, you don't get time to ask those kind of questions, and certainly if you ask them out loud, you're likely to be silenced and shut down. So something very unusual is happening. Would you agree? Biden's string of American exceptionalist cliches has since been given a vintage election year chaser. What if more wars represents an invaluable economic opportunity? In an Oval Office address earlier this week, the president said just as much, dressing up new military spending in the language of economic nationalism and even name-dropping particular swing states where his advisors cynically expect the message to resonate. These wars have been cynically mobilized for economic and political purposes, literally in swing states. There could be more jobs in Arizona, so who do you want to vote for in the forthcoming election? That is not how such a complex and difficult situation should be handled. Do you not sometimes think that we are approaching a more and more dangerous scenario, and that the people in charge are not reliable, that they're not telling you the truth, that the agenda is not being explicitly stated, other than someone saying, look, it's this. Either we are able to dominate the world, or China are going to dominate the world, or Russia are going to dominate the world, or Islamic terrorists are going to dominate the world. You'd have to then evaluate whether or not that assessment was accurate, whether or not you trusted these people to carry out that operation, and whether or not they were being honest about the economic undergirdings of that argument, i.e. how are Raytheon, Lockheed Martin and the donor class benefiting from this situation. Until that's extracted, I don't think you can get a clear picture of what's happening. Whatever these wars are, it is not beneficial to ordinary Americans in their everyday lives. In fact, there's a strong argument that this will place ordinary Americans at risk, whether overseas and potentially even domestically, if it causes, as it seems that it will, an enormous refugee crisis, as apparently that is something that is well documented and understood, and WikiLeaks have revealed that that is part of the plan. There's not only a migration crisis, of course, but the likelihood that dispossessed, broken people across the world will find themselves in North America and European countries, and perhaps feeling that America and other nations did not have their interests at heart when it came to previous decisions. I mean, generally over the last few years, has the displacement of people and agitation of domestic populations in the Middle East been beneficial for Americans? Is the world a safer place post-Iraq? I mean, it took COVID to shut down ISIS. What is the real agenda that's driving American involvement in these global conflicts? Support was declining for continuing aid to Ukraine because of the failure of the counteroffensive, because there were obvious domestic problems, notably Hawaii, where American people felt their resources might be better directed. Let's have a look at how the defense industry really regards this type of conflict as opposed to what they say publicly. After Israel declared war in response to Hamas killing over 1,400 Israelis and taking around 200 hostages, the stocks of major American and European war profiteers soared, according to a report from Eyes on the Ties. 5 industry giants collectively recorded $195.6 billion in military-related revenue last year. They are Boeing, $30.8 billion, General Dynamics, $30.4 billion, Lockheed Martin, $69.3 billion, and Northrop Grumman, $32.4 billion, and RTX, formerly Raytheon, $39.6 billion. The top shareholders in these 5 defense companies largely consist of big asset managers or big banks with asset management wings that include BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, Capital Group, Wellington, JP Morgan, Chase, Morgan Stanley, Newport Trust Company, Longview Asset Management, Massachusetts Financial Services Company, Geode Capital, and Bank of America. Eyes on the Ties also highlighted how chief executives are handsomely compensated and the CEO's ties to big pharma, the fossil fuel industry, Wall Street, and foreign policy think tanks such as the Council on Foreign Relations and Center for Strategic and International Studies. During third quarter earnings calls this month, analysts from Morgan Stanley and TD Bank took note of this potential profit-making escalation in conflict and asked unusually blunt questions about the financial benefit of the war between Israel and Hamas.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Big thing that happened is a couple days ago there was a Time magazine piece written by the same guy who gave Zelensky the Person of the Year, which it really did mark, and you see this happen a lot in the media, in the establishment, corporate media, where you see there's a very weird dynamic, and we've all, I mean literally every single person listening to this show right now, me and you, we've all experienced this a lot, where there's this weird dynamic where there's a thing you've been saying for a while that is totally illegitimate to say. And you're a bad person if you say it. And everybody who knows anything and every single expert will tell you that is totally wrong and you're fucked up for saying this and you're not. And then all of a sudden, one day, it's just printed. And it's just okay to say it now. And now it's totally fine. I mean, the examples we could come up with this are countless, but like everything from like the vaccine doesn't actually stop the spread of COVID, or like
mass working.
Yes.
The virus coming out of the lab.
Yes, that's a great example. The virus, the lab leak theory, which at a time would literally get you banned off of all social media platforms. All of a sudden, it is just okay to say that. And then it's actually, yeah, that's probably what happened. And now everybody, even Fauci, like even guys like that who would have said, you're a horrible person for saying this, will now say, yeah, it's definitely a possibility. And we're looking into, So anyway, what happened with this Time magazine piece is now all of a sudden, the things we've been saying for quite a while you're allowed to say it. We've, just in the last few years, me and you have been ahead of several of these things. But what the piece was basically saying is that Ukraine can't possibly win the war, that they know that the war can't be won. All the Pentagon has, for the entire last year, they've been, what are you talking about? The counteroffensive's going great. Ukraine's going to win. We have to keep funding them because they're going to win. And now it's all of Zelensky's top people. They even called him delusional in the piece. And it was reported in this piece that the military is straight up ignoring orders. They're telling them to march forward and they're refusing. The generals on the ground are like, we're not going to do that because our military has been destroyed. And then there was an announcement just earlier today that that the Americans are pushing negotiations. So it seems like there's been kind of, as there are in these moments a lot, there's this drastic pivot toward there's never like an apology that comes along with it. There's never a recognition that we were wrong for smearing all the people who said this, but it does seem like there's a pivot to now kind of being like, okay, we're gonna move away from this war. We were joking on the live show the other day that America's like, look, you knew what this was, Ukraine, but this is my Israel's my wife. Like, you were just my side piece. But it is a pretty big. It's a big deal. This has been one of the biggest stories in the world for the last couple of years, and it's pretty crazy that just like this, they will once again get away with pivoting toward what we've been saying the whole time without any admission.
And a lot of people needlessly died. We basically just caused countless Ukrainian deaths for absolutely no payoff whatsoever. And for all the war hawkery of China, Taiwan, I mean, this must make it so much more likely that China goes, hey, I can get away with taking Taiwan.
It's there's certainly a strong argument to that. It's amazing how much of the war propaganda will just evaporate at this point. All of the things like, well, if Vladimir Putin gets Luhansk, then he takes Poland. And next thing you know, he's in Germany. Right. Is that a concern anymore? Or, like, let's be honest, everyone's going to drop that because they knew it was bullshit. And the crazy thing about it is that I remember, because I had a lot of debates about Ukraine. I did several of them. And I did a few Rogan appearances where I talked a lot about Ukraine. So I heard back from a lot of people. I got a lot of feedback off this thing. In fact, the biggest video clip I've ever done was off the war in Ukraine. Like, it went more viral than anything I've ever done. And it's amazing how much people, like real people, not like, people who are like being paid by Raytheon. I mean, just like real people will repeat the things they've heard from the corporate press to you. Like, they will genuinely tell you, like as if they believe it, that no, but if he wins in Ukraine, then Vladimir Putin is going to reconstitute the Soviet Union and he's going to move into Poland. And then we've got a war with NATO and all of these problems. And it's just interesting in this moment to see. It's like, dude, like you, real person who's arguing that. Look, they don't even believe this because if they did, at least one of them would be like, okay, we got to stop funding this war in Ukraine, but the real concern here is what we told you the concern was this whole time.
Right.
But you won't hear a word about that because no one's actually concerned. No one's actually thinks that Vladimir Putin is going to move into Poland next. And so, anyway, it's just like, you'd hope at least for some of those people, you're like, look, even they know this is bullshit. You're repeating the propaganda that these people will just abandon the second it's unpopular.
Yeah, that's when hopefully people actually go after them at the debates. Like, do you know that your policy is responsible for X amount of Ukrainian deaths? Do you know that the region will never recover? Like, you know what I mean? That's where you really have to go after these people. Your policy caused the following harm. What was the payoff? It's
such a good point because, look, I mean, we were simultaneously discouraging negotiations as of a year and a half ago. And on top of that, we were funding the war, giving them a blank check. So if Vladimir Putin ends up getting whatever he wants now, which is what clearly is going to happen, all we did was prolong the war for no benefit.
Yeah, how much money did we spend? How much death was there? And then where's the accountability? Unless Putin ends up invading and taking all of Europe, and you and I were wrong this whole fucking time, and we got to eat crow, how many people are going to be fired for the deaths and money lost on what was just a failed philosophy? It wasn't true.
Yeah.
Like, how many times can we keep taking actions on things that they say is absolutes, and then you turn around, they're unequivocally false, and everyone just gets to keep their job, and just the whole system, it just moves on. It drives me nuts.
Well, there was, we had on our last episode that we did before we left on this trip, we did the segment on Bill Maher's show.
Right.
And that clip, shout out to Chief Nerd, who's fucking, I love that guy. He promotes the fuck out of our shit. Great Twitter follow, by the way. If you're not following him, go check him out. But he shared that clip, so that clip went pretty viral too. But it was the thing. One of the things that was really incredible about that was just this moment, and I think the reason why it went viral and the reason why that clip, what we did, like kind of resonated with people, was because it is unbelievable where no matter how right we are. And when I say we, I don't mean to take like the credit from me and you. I'm speaking broadly of us, the people listening. Rob, I'm talking about Rob, only Rob. But you know what I mean? Like, no matter how correct all these dissident voices are and how wrong the regime gets it, no matter what, there's always this kind, because we were talking about it earlier. Like, there'll be something like, well, the fact that we took a stand there is the reason why Putin didn't invade Poland, right? They'll have some way to spin it. But what was crazy about that clip on Bill Maher's show is that even then, even when they had no way to spin it, When they had, he's just like, look, I was on a school board and I was arguing for school closures, and that turns out to be completely wrong. But, it's these people who are just trying to get their Twitter likes by making us all look bad. We were working with imperfect information, and the noble people at the CDC were doing the best they could, and that gets a round of applause. So it's like, even when they're just admitting we got it all wrong, they still somehow try to spin it in a way where it's like, but you're the jerk. So that's what's going to happen with this. That's what happens every single time.
Imperfect intelligence. We had imperfect intelligence when we said that Putin was going to go take all of Europe. Well, you cost 100,000 lives for imperfect intelligence.
One of the ways that Hamilton helped build this kind of unlimited federal power reservoir was through this doctrine of implied powers. Now, during the ratification debates, he had a completely different approach on how you were going to read the Constitution. And here from Mike Meharry, even Hamilton took up the limited federal power banner, writing this in Federalist 32. The state governments, quote, would clearly retain all rights of sovereignty which they before had and which were not by that act exclusively delegated to the United States. So the central government or the general government, according to Hamilton, before ratification, was not going to have unlimited power. It was going to be very much limited by those things that were exclusively delegated. But Meharry points out that it didn't take Hamilton long to change his tune. Less than 3 years after the ratification of the Constitution, Hamilton discovered implied powers hidden in the Constitution to justify Congress chartering the first bank of the United States. So Hamilton wanted a national bank. We have another version of that national bank, much worse, today, and the basis for it was implied powers that he discovered a few years after ratification, after he said there wasn't going to be any applied powers. Opponents of the bank, Mike writes, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, argued that the lack of specific delegated authority barred Congress from chartering a bank. So they didn't see it, and I don't see it in there either. You don't see anything in the Constitution that authorizes them to do this, but Hamilton then made the case that, of course, well, there are other powers other than what's been delegated. Even though I told you in the New York Ratifying Convention that whatever is not expressly delegated to the federal head is reserved to the members. That's what he said in July of 1788. Suddenly now it's a different take. He said it is not denied. So this is just indisputable truth, according to Hamilton in 1791, that there are implied as well as express powers, and that the former are as effectually delegated as the latter. And for the sake of accuracy, it shall be mentioned that there is another class of powers which may be properly denominated resting powers. He's got all kinds of powers. Suddenly they're going to have all kinds of powers because he wanted them to be able to do things that they weren't authorized to do. Now, mind you, I mentioned this in Friday's episode as well, that even though New York, when they sent him to the Philadelphia Convention, they sent him with express instructions that he was not allowed to do anything beyond proposing amendments to the Articles of Confederation. So the fact that he disregarded, now, of course, there's an argument to be made that he wasn't proposing anything. He was just talking about a plan. That was his take on this. And of course, people who want to violate the rules given to them always have a convenient excuse as to why they can get away with it, and they're not breaking the rules. And that's exactly what he did in the Philadelphia Convention as well. One of the ways to get unlimited power is to suddenly have implied powers. Patrick Henry warned us that allowing them implied powers meant we'd have 10,000 of them, and it's probably closer to 30,000 or more. So he even underestimated how bad it could get. And number three, another one of the ways that Hamilton helped give us this near or total unlimited federal power was by redefining words. And I think the most important one that he used was the word necessary. He redefined the meaning of the word necessary in his arguments in support of that national bank in 1791. Now, when the Constitution was ratified, the word necessary meant, well, necessary. But Hamilton didn't like that. Here's how he put it. It is essential to the being of the national government that so, mind you, he says the national government. He doesn't say federal government because his goal was a national one-size-fits-all. And if you listen to Friday's episode or watch that one, you'll see that he didn't even want states. He was very clear in saying the only reason he didn't really propose totally getting rid of them is because he recognized that would be a shock to the public. So he is like, how can we kind of get around these pesky states and create a one-size-fits-all national government while keeping them kind of in place? And he gave a whole proposal for how to do that. And so here he is talking about it again, even after ratification, even after he didn't get what he wanted, he still pushes for it anyways. And that's a real manipulator, some kind of a socio, I guess. It is essential to the being of the national government, Hamilton wrote, that so erroneous a conception of the meaning of the word necessary should be exploded. You got to absolutely smash the idea that the word necessary means necessary. It sounds like what we live under today. The idea, it's so Orwellian. War is peace. I mean, the idea that you can just change what a word means in order to justify more government power is not something new. Hamilton was all about that. He said, it is certain that neither the grammatical nor popular sense of the term requires that construction. According to both, necessary often means something other than necessary. He said, according to both, necessary often means no more than needful, requisite, incidental, useful or conducive to. I mean, I have never used the word necessary in that way. It's necessary for you to finish your homework doesn't mean, well, it'd be useful or helpful to do it. It's just not how people use it. So he's absolutely lying here. In that speech or in that paper, he actually used the word convenient or convenience almost a dozen times. So he was using this over and over and over. And then even though, well, Aaron Burr took care of him, I mean, not a lot of people were fans of Aaron Burr either. So even though that ended up going down, Hamilton's necessary means convenient stuck around. Of course, we had the First National Bank that led to much more, but Chief Justice John Marshall some years later in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, he adopted in some places, word for word, the Hamiltonian approach, the Hamiltonian definition. James Madison criticized this in a letter to Spencer Roane in 1819 in September. We'll link to this in the show notes. He basically wrote, and I'll read it here in just a moment, he basically said that the Constitution, the people who were considering ratification, never would have supported ratification had this been the commonly understood use of the word necessary. If the people who are, especially if we're thinking about places like New York and Massachusetts, it was barely ratified. Same with Virginia, it was also very close. New York, very close. The idea that some people that were kind of on the margins there would have said no had they been told that the word necessary meant, well, just convenient to government power. I think it's hard to argue against James Madison there that they probably would have lost and we wouldn't have had the Constitution. So it was a matter of presenting one case beforehand, lying about it really, and then flipping the switch later when you wanted to twist things around to expand power. And that's basically what we get with the Hamiltonian system, and that's really how most politicians act today.
You know, I lost a lot of confidence, as some people would realize, that something big happened in the 60s when our law enforcement agencies started assassinating our political leaders, and things have not been quite right since.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, you know, you talk about them not wanting Trump to be a candidate. Well, something else was happening when this poll came out. Something very interesting happened in the Democratic Party. Dr. Paul, put up this next one. Now, this is David Axelrod. He is considered the architect behind the Obama victories. He said, only Joe Biden can make this decision. If he continues to run, he will be the nominee of the Democratic Party. What he needs to decide is whether this is wise, whether it's in his best interest or the country's. That is a very strong, delicately worded, but very specific way of saying, listen, guy, you need to get out. And if you need someone who's a little less nuanced, we'll go to the next one. Here's Bill Kristol, who tweeted after this came out. He said, it's time. President Biden has served our country well. I'm confident he'll do so for the next year. But it's time for him to act for an act of personal sacrifice and public spirit. It's time to pass the torch to the next generation. It's time for Biden to announce he won't run in 2024. These are very dramatic comments from people who are big Biden supporters.
The question I've had, and I've mentioned to you, is who really pulls the strings? Because the president and the vice president, I don't think anybody in this country believe they really know what's going on or that they have an influence and they command respect on the international stage. I mean, that doesn't happen. But somebody's pulling it.
Well, this is what he points out. This and other organized attack on our former president are paid for by George Soros's web of charities, along with the Citizens for Ethics crew, which is a 501c3 involved in political witch hunts. The group even boasted about it on X, formerly Twitter. They said, we just sued to enforce the 14th Amendment and keep Donald Trump off the ballot in Colorado. So that's what's happening. And at the end of the day, that's going to be their nuclear option, I think.
And that'll just give more support for Trump.
Yeah,
Who ever heard of in America that they take your enemy and you charge him with silly crimes that they can't prove subjectively? But he's an insurrectionist, isn't he? Was he tried for that?
Not even charged, yeah.
Oh, we forgot to charge him, so we couldn't try him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really crazy. But there was one incident that I wasn't too proud of with our government, our party, and Trump. But nobody said anything. Essentially, his opposition didn't call attention to it, and the Republicans didn't seem to care. And that was the assassination of Soleimani.
Yeah.
And if you talk about diplomacy and all, but it went by, and that to me is really sad, because that's how you take borderline friendships with some countries. You might as well destroy it.
Yeah.
Look at how often we do some things and we sort of get along with somebody, then we turn around and say, oh yeah, they did this, we have to put on sanctions and not let them freeze their assets and all that kind of stuff. Just looking for trouble. But we're hamstrung because if we do too much of that, then we don't love America.
Yeah.
But maybe the people who care about justice and the Constitution, maybe there's a love of America there they don't have any understanding of.
Well, here's some people that I think don't love America, and probably for good reason. And I think this image is iconic. If you can put this next one up. This is our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, over the weekend. going in a secret trip to Baghdad. He was over there already. He takes a secret, he lands in Baghdad, and here he is in the cover of Night with a bulletproof vest on. And this commentator who posted it, it's been posted everywhere, but he makes a good point. Trillions of dollars in Iraq, 2 decades of war, thousands of American lives lost, thousands more injured, and this is how Secretary Blinken has to arrive in Baghdad, home of the largest U.S. embassy in the world. And you've commented on that embassy. Here he's going, the largest embassy. Remember, we were told they were going to greet us as liberators. Does that look to you, Dr. Paul, like he's being greeted as a liberator? It's amazing.
You know, nothing has stopped our protection of our empire. You know, when you look at what's going on in Syria and Iraq and at the various countries over there, what you're just talking about is, yeah, we really didn't have a victory in Iraq. We don't own Iraq. We're not even good at maintaining an empire because it's so wrong for us. But we've been continuing to bomb. You know, look how much involvement we've had in Ukraine, but Syria too.
Oh yeah.
But we own a third of Syria, and we have to protect our oil and all this stuff. That's unfortunately doesn't get much discussion in the debates. Maybe somebody will try to bring it up, but that's not in the cards most likely on what's going on there.
Biden is getting shellacked in the polls over his handling of Israel-Gaza thing. His own party is furious. There are breaks in the Democratic Party that we have not seen. Massive protests, 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. over the weekend protesting, and a lot of these people I think are Democrat voters. So he goes over to Netanyahu and says, hey, Bibi, I need a favor, man. I need you just to pause for a while. My boss is getting creamed over here. I need a little bit of help. Put on this next clip because this would be like if a picture tells 1,000 stories. Here, look at him. Look at the look on Blinken's face and look at Bibi. He's like, come on, Bibi. Can you just pause for a second? We got that 14 billion coming, man. It's going to be great. Can you pause and then go to the next one? Bibi says, nah. He says, right after Blinken left, Israel will keep bombarding Gaza with all of its power. Netanyahu says after Blinken calls for a pause. And can you imagine, Dr. Paul, you were going there with $14 billion in your pocket you're going to give a guy, and you ask him for a little favor, and the guy says, take a hike, go pound sand. You know,
where they are now is a total lack of realism. It's almost like the lack of realism and understanding how our president and our vice president should give us some assurances that they're dealing with protecting our freedoms. You know, everybody's concerned about. But when you look at that, Netanyahu, he's not very popular over there.
No.
They say, no, we're not going to get rid of him until we win the war.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So they're not realistic.
To add insult to injury, Blinken comes over there, hat in hand, please stop bombing. Netanyahu says, no, forget you. And what does he do the very next day? Put on that next clip. He bombs a convoy of ambulances in Gaza. Put on this clip, you can see the bodies under the, don't look too closely, but this is a tweet by the Doctors Without Borders, that's the international humanitarian group. And they said, this is Dr. Obeid, he's a Médecins Sans Frontières doctor at the Al-Shifa hospital. He says, we're standing inside the hospital gate when the ambulance was directly hit in front of us. There were bloody bodies everywhere. Many were killed immediately while we rushed others to the operating room for emergency care. These are doctors who volunteer in war zones.